Now we're going to dive deeper into our understanding of Python programming by trying to build more complicated programs. And the way we're going to do that is by using functionality that other programmers have already written in what's called the Python standard libraries, or simply the Python libraries. So we're going to learn how we can use functions that are written by others. In fact, we've already been learning how to use functions by others when we learned how to use print and the eval and input functions on the previous exercises. And now we're going to deepen our understanding of that. Now I'm assuming at this point you have already completed the reading worksheet learning exercise where the questions ask you to look at a piece of code and try and predict what it will output. This is a really important skill that we'll need to develop throughout the course. So I'm assuming that you've already looked at that before and attempted it before looking at the solutions. And so that's what I say when I say the solutions are to be used wisely, that I'm assuming before you look at the solutions that you've already attempted the problems. And if you have any other questions, there are some optional slides that are available for additional information. And you can always refer to the textbook chapters. Now, I'm assuming that you're ready to tackle writing your own problems. And this is how most of the units in this course will be modeled. We'll start with reading unfamiliar code, trying to predict what it outputs, seeing where our intuitions don't match reality, and deepening our understanding. Then we're going to take a stab at writing code. And these processes will flip-flop back and forth between reading code and writing code. The writing problems, I'll admit, are the most challenging. So we're going to try these writing problems. I'm assuming at this point you have made your best effort to solve the writing problems, and that before looking at the solutions or watching this video, you've tried to ask questions on Slack or the discussion boards to try and get as far as you can in this process yourself. The farther you can get towards solving these problems on your own, the better prepared you'll be to tackle the problems that I ask you in a quiz or an exam situation. Okay, so let's look at our writing problems. So we have two, quote, fun programs, and the fun means using functions, mad.py and maths.py. So I'm going to open PyCharm, and I have my sandbox project. I am going to create a new Python file, and I'm going to call it mad.py as indicated on the learning exercise. Okay, so I'm supposed to write a program mad.py that asks the user to enter a phrase and then prints out the following. So what I recommend when developing a Python program is that we develop them incrementally. What I mean by that is I try to write as little code as I can to move my process forward, and then I run it and I test it and I make sure that it works. That way, if I have a bug, I know right where the bug will be because it's got to be in the code I just wrote. So by keeping the pieces of code we write small and testing frequently, and running our code frequently, that's what test means. Test means to run our code and verify that it's working correctly. By doing this very frequently, it helps smooth the development process. Okay, so I know how to write a program that enters a phrase because I can use the input function. So I'm going to create a line of code that asks the user to enter a phrase. Now you might notice I just put a space here at the prompt, and that's so when the user enters their phrase, it's not right on top of the colon. Now, how will I know that the phrase was input correctly? Well, I'm going to print it. So that's the minimal program I can write to try and begin implementing mad.py. Now I have to run it. See, so I'm going to run my program. Okay, and I have to click down in the run window to enter my phrase. Hallelujah! Awesome. So I've got the basics working. Okay, so now I want to write out the mad version of the phrase in all caps. I don't really know how to do that. I printed it out. I printed out my phrase, but the phrase wasn't in all caps. Well, one thing I can do is I can try to explore functions that Python has included. Now, typically, you can also use the reading code exercise to get hints of what kind of functions are out there. Another way you can get hints is if you have a string or a variable and you want to get something from it. See how I've placed my cursor right at the end of the phrase variable where I want to print it? If I hit dot, ooh, look at that, capitalize. Well, gosh, that sounds pretty promising. Let's go with it. Let's test it. Let's see if it works. Okay, I have to type a phrase. Ooh, that's close. That's close. But it's not quite there yet. Because capitalize apparently only capitalizes the first letter. I want to make sure I can really understand this. So I'm going to try again and print out something longer, a longer phrase. Oh, so now I've learned through experimentation that capitalize only capitalizes the first letter. For instance, I also happen to know in Python there is a function called title. And so if I run that and do hi there, it's going to capitalize the beginning of every word. Again, that's not quite what I'm looking for. So I'm going to delete title and the dot and retype the dot. And I'm going to start skimming through to see if I can find something that looks more likely. Ooh, there's the title we used before. And then here is upper. I want uppercase. Let's try that. Haha! Success. So now I've succeeded. And I hope that what you're doing is watching the process that I'm using to figure out what code I need to write. I didn't know right away what function it was. I had to experiment a couple times, but that's the process of development. Okay, and I'm going to make a note to myself that this is part A of the problem. Okay, now I need to write a confused version of the phrase where all letter E's are replaced by X's. So I'm going to write print phrase dot. Okay. All letter E's are replaced by X. Index is identifier, no. Is title, no. Lower, I don't know what strip means. Partition, ooh, replace. Now I don't quite know what replace does. Let's see if I mouse over it if it'll tell me. Well, shucks. Okay, so I'm pretty sure replace might be the place to start, but I don't know how to use it. This is where Google is our friend. So I'm going to open up a new window and search for Python string replace. One of the useful skills as computer scientists is figuring out how to use Google effectively and what to type to get at what you're looking for. And then recognizing good learning resources for you when you find them. For example, the learning resources that I use might not be the best ones for you. And so everyone starts to find what is most effective for their learning. So what I often do is I try to type as much information about what I'm looking for as I can. I'm looking in Python, so I don't want to get learning resources or results that are talking about Java. That's not our programming language. I'm working with a string, and the specific function I'm working with is the replace function. So let's see if I can get an example. All right. So I see a couple resources here. There's like Geeks for Geeks. Stack Overflow is super common. This is used by developers everywhere. The challenge for a beginner, though, could be that you don't understand the answer because the vocabulary they're using may not yet be something that you're familiar with. And so if you don't understand it, that's fine. I go to Stack Overflow all the time. Tutorials Point is very common. You know, I don't know what any of these look like, and I can just try one and see what it looks like. Ooh, look, remember we talked about syntax. It tells us the syntax of the function. Oh, and here's an example. So it looks like we've got the old parameter is the string we want to replace, and then the new one is what we want to replace it with. And optionally, see these square braces here in the syntax? That is used in the Python documentation to indicate when a parameter to a function call is optional. So max means we will only enter so many. But if we go back to our problem, we are trying to replace all letter E's by X's. So let's try. We should say replace old comma new. So the old thing we're replacing are E's, and we want to replace them with X's. Okay, I've got a problem. And you see the red underlines? I've typed these in and they look like variables, but we actually want literal string literals, E and X. So I have to add that in. Okay, let's try it. I'm going to enter a phrase. Hello there. Good. Awesome. And I'd like to show you one more resource you could have used to figure out how to use replace. If I change my Google query, instead of typing Python string replace, I can also say Python API. API stands for Application Programmers Interface. And that is going to lead you directly to the documentation on python.org. Okay, and then when I'm in here, I can look for replace. Okay, and I can see, I'm trying to find, here we go. We'll get in here. Let's search for string.replace. Here we go. So this is the official documentation from python.org. And while I find it useful, I actually don't prefer it if it's a very commonly used function that lots of people have used. I prefer to see it used as an example. And the Python documentation, unfortunately, doesn't give any examples. So it's a definitive resource. But, for example, let's just try Geeks for Geeks. We saw a tutorials point. It's going to include information about from the API documentation, but what these tutorials often gives us are also examples that allow us to see exactly how it's used. And I personally find that I learn best from examples. And so each of you will need to figure out, well, how do you learn best? How do you learn about these things the best? And then that'll help you determine what to search for. Okay, so you worked through that. Awesome. And now the maddest of all, we want to print whether the phrase is printable. So print phrase dot. Now let me see, does something look like printable? Let's see, we've got all these is functions here. There we go, is printable. Now I have no idea what is printable is going to do. Let's try to see by trial and error and experimentation. Maybe it means can we print it out, or is it being printed? Let's see. Okay, so phrase is printable. And that's another way that I could search, that's another thing I could search for. So for example, this would be a case where it might make sense to look at the API. Python API is printable. I forgot string, but I could have put string in there too. So here's some documentation. Now remember, we're using Python 3, but there's also a Stack Overflow response that I can look at. And so Stack Overflow always starts with a question, and then it has some responses. So string module has a printable, and so basically it's determining if the string, if all the elements of the string are printable or not. So what's a non-printable string? I'm going to click on this documentation and see digits, letters, ASCII letters, if you recall from encoding, punctuation, and the white space are all considered to be printable. I wonder if there's corresponding non-printable. I think there are a number of characters that you can't see. And so, for example, delete has a character related to it, but that might not be a printable character. Okay. So let's go back and make sure that we completed our exercise. It looks correct. It looks like we meet the requirements for the question specification, A, B, and C.